Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and
Good
welcome
evening,
to a
everyone. Welcome
special.
to Black Men Speak. Is it? Am I going to do the intro? Or are you going to do it? Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Get already started. Go ahead, Tom.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name
Go
is
ahead.
Tommy Duncan, also known as TD3. Welcome to a special Martin Luther King Jr. National Holiday special edition of Black Men Speak. I am your co-host, D. Tommy D. Duncan III.
And I am the J.R. Stewart.
And Jimmy, it is Monday night, January 15th, 2024, Jimmy. And for once, if it is Monday night,
It's certainly Black Men Speak. Let's give a big shout out to Liquid for providing our theme music, for our own studio, and Forest Films for providing our virtual studio, which we had a little trouble with to start with. So I hope it wasn't too much of a disruption. And Forest Films has they've actually donated a video to play, which we'll play somewhere during the show. With that being said, Tom, let's get started with our announcements and in our special program.
you know what? We are just going to start with the introduction of our special guest in the program. One of the things that we do know is when we do have the great Professor Clarence Glover on time, we typically run out of time pretty quick. And so, you know what? We are going to defer any announcements and or special acknowledgments until our normal show on Wednesday. And what we're going to do is go ahead and announce our special guest for this evening on the MLK holiday. So without further ado, Jimmy, I'd like to take a couple of minutes just to introduce our special guest, unless, Jimmy, you have something brief before I introduce Professor Glover.
No, go ahead. Let's jump into it. Let's do
All
what we
right, good
do
deal.
best.
All right, all right. Professor Clarence Glover Jr., also known as Professor Freedom, was born and raised in Shreveport, Louisiana, and is a graduate of Grambling State University, where he received his Bachelor of Arts degree in history. After earning his bachelor's degree, he attended Southern Methodist University, earned his master's of theological studies degree. He is also a graduate of the Harvard University Graduate Institute of School Climate and Governance with a concentration in the area of moral education and human development. He is president of the Sankofa Educational Services, and quite frankly, we would probably take about 10 minutes if I really read through all of the great credentials. But what I would like to do is highlight a couple of things that you do need to be aware of. He is well known for his expertise on the life and work of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement in 1986 at the request of Ms. Coretta Scott King. He served as the coordinator and interviewer for the classic PBS documentary In Remembrance of Martin, the first National Martin Luther King Jr. holiday observance, which was filmed in Atlanta, Georgia. He is a man of all seasons. He has been on the grind and doing his work for several decades, probably longer than some of our young people have been alive. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce him now into our audience. Of course, anybody who has been watching our show for at least a year or so knows this gentleman. He is no foreigner to our show. We want to thank you, Professor Glover, for taking the time to join us this evening so that we can share our thoughts on your work, the legacy of Dr. King, and where we go from here. Welcome, 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 Professor Glover.
Thank you so very much, gentlemen. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you on this Dr. King holiday season, particularly during this time when we are all frozen across the nation. Virtual to celebrate not only Dr. King, but to recognize the movement. So I hats off to Black Men Speak, to Brother Jimmy, for that. And every year, during the season, which is 28 years since I was in Atlanta with Mrs. King and the members of the family and others, but these are my credentials that I always show and have given to me by Mrs. King, both my staff credentials as a member of the King staff and my press credentials. And this is a way of me remind me of the importance of this day and the 2 weeks that we spent there in Atlanta. The documentary is entitled In Remembrance of Martin, the PBS documentary of the first Martin Luther King holiday. It is available through PBS. And so I do encourage individuals to contact PBS, schools, organizations, individuals, and purchase a copy. And I have something else I'd just like to share. It's fairly large, but this is the official portrait of Dr. King given to me by Business King that hangs in our office there. And so I'm very humbled during this season, not only to reflect on Dr. King, but to talk about the very important work that we need to continue to be doing today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Glover. So, one of the things that, we have talked about, over the time that we have known each other, which has not been a very long time in context to how long you've been in Dallas and doing the work, you had made me aware of something because I'd like to kind of cover two areas. One, obviously, is the PBS interview, but one thing that a lot of people, especially from Dallas area, were not aware of was the speech that Dr. King gave at the Southern Methodist University, your alma mater, back in 1966. And a lot of folks from Dallas, including myself, were not even aware of this until recently.
That's correct.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of it either.
In the academic community, Dr. King was turned away at the airport by local African American ministers. Dallas was very controlled at that time, as it's today. And so, therefore, there was an effort not to have a movement come to Dallas. When I say the movement, like in Selma, Montgomery, St. Augustine, Florida, Chicago. So, but Dr. King did come to speak here. Dr. H. Rap James, who was involved in the NAACP, brought him here, but to speak with ministers, so in private conversations, meetings. The first time he came was in 1956 to speak at Good Street Baptist Church at the youth program under Reverend Caesar Clark when it was over on Good Lattimore. But when I was at SMU, I started going to the King Center in 1980, working with King and the staff and Dr. Lafayette and others. We were celebrating the holiday of Dr. King before it became a national holiday, as you know, with Stevie Wonder's record that helped to propel it to a national holiday. But when I spoke at Perkins Chapel in 1981 at SMU and on Dr. King's holiday at that time, the man, the dream, and the people. After that particular lecture, the sermon I gave there at SMU, Dr. Willis Tate came to me, the former president of SMU, and said, "Clarence, did you know that Dr. King spoke here?" I said, "No, sir," and I did not know that. He said, "Yes." When he was president, the Student Association, and he, at that time himself, the president, extended two invitations. The first one he could not accept, but he did accept one from 1966. And he came to the university, but the tape and the news articles were nowhere to be found on campus. So I spent several years doing research until I found the news articles, and I found the actual tape, which was on reel at the time, and we had to transfer it to digital and to DVD, then the digital, and now it's online. So I want to say to everyone this evening, no matter where you are, you can go online to SMU, locate Dr. Martin Luther King, speech at SMU, and you can hear the entire 1 hour lecture. It's not a rally speech, it's a lecture. So the university is very, very involved and very intense. You need to hear that on the history of integration. And then recently here, students picked up the charge, and because we start celebrating Dr. King's holiday at SMU then, now that we've placed a marker, the university has placed a historical marker at McFarland as commemoration of that. So, and it's on transcript as well. So Dallas has a great piece of history of Dr. King. We have the speech, we have the transcript, and it's something that we should be processing. I think we'll maybe be sharing at least a bit of it tonight, I hope, an excerpt, so that we might hear his voice here in Dallas on this evening.
Gotcha. You know, there were so many great speeches that Dr. King gave in his much too short life, but when you consider what he was able to accomplish during the period of time that we had him, I mean, he lived several lifetimes, considering the short life that we had with him. So when you consider the speech that he gave at SMU, and I've actually pulled it down and read it, and there are a lot of interesting things that he said, gave some historical perspective. Of course, he advocated and talked about his nonviolent approach to seeking freedom and equality for African Americans in the United States. What would you consider to be the most poignant areas of his speech for you in Dallas, number one? And number two, why do you think it was such a hidden jewel that so many people, even in Dallas, didn't even know?
Well, boy, you're talking about a jewel. Here again, we're talking about not a rally speech. We're talking about a clear lecture, not from notes, but from his head and heart. And he stands there at the podium and literally educates the university at that time, predominantly whites in the audience, very few African Americans. Jerry Levias, who was the African American student who was one of the first in the South in the district of SMU to play football there, spent time with Dr. King, and he counseled him there about integrating the campus and the football team. But my point is that there's so many points. The theme of his speech was the history of integration. And he goes back, and some of the things you are familiar, if you're familiar with Dr. King's lectures, he does use some of the familiar things. But in this speech, he talks about the history, bringing of African American people starting in 1619, going back even before. Here we just recently heard about 1619. Dr. King was talking about it back then. He will weave together the history of this nation and talk about the disparity in terms of the relationship between creed and deed, in terms of the creeds of the nation versus the deeds of the nation. And he gave an analogy, he talked about the movements and what was happening in various cities and why they were using nonviolence and so forth and so on. It is a must study. And because Dallas is such at the epicenter of this nation's history, both in terms of the cotton industry coming from the Deep South, coming to America. He just mentioned this in the speech as well, that cotton, made America king. And that's a part of my work right now here in Dallas, because Dallas was the epicenter, Deep Elm Street, the cotton industry of Munger and all of that. So he alludes to that and goes on and talks about the history. Then he talks about racism and the whole construction of the narrative of racism, which we need to break down. And what I like to emphasize here is that we should not make this a day about Dr. King as a human being alone. Hello?
Yes, we're here. We can hear you.
Can you see me, sir?
Yes, you're here.
Oh, and so as we assess Dr. King's life, we must process not just what he did, but all the men and women who worked with him, brilliant minds, and so to look at where we were then as to where we are today, you see.
Yes.
And so that's what I submit to you that we must do. And this speech gives us that opportunity here in Dallas to have a jewel and to break it down and to help Dallas become the example, i.e. Texas. And that's one of the things I'm alluding to tonight, is because my theme has to do with from human diversity to human dignity, because the movement continues. Because during Dr. King, which I was a part of, those of us who started diversity programs on college and university campuses, were trying to educate, train people about the differences and et cetera. And now we see House Bill number 17, which has removed diversity programs for public education in Texas. And so now we say, well, let's move to dignity, that every human being, no matter who they are, must have dignity. And we have these, and include the white male who is now reacting both in Florida, DeSantis, as well as in Washington with January 6th. These are individuals who have always had human dignity in America by birth, by the right of their birth as in America, must recognize that all human beings deserve that. And Dr. King made a quote here, and I like to make that quote, which supports this concept, this theory. Somehow we must believe that the most misguided among them can learn to respect the dignity and the worth of all human personality. So in that quote, he recognized that there are those back then and now who would not recognize the dignity and the worth of all human personality. So as we speak to men and women, and particularly white men, who are feeling this pain about the sharing of the nation with others, then we must recognize that it is about having dignity for all human beings, that there should be no barriers to human dignity.
Understandable. And just as an aside, Professor Glover, it looks like you have fallen off of the screen. We obviously do still have your audio, but I think that whatever channel you logged in from, your phone or your computer, has fallen off the screen. So I'm going to pull you back in into the and see if we can get your video. It looks like your video is off, but you are definitely on the screen. And what I'm going to do, and he just fell out again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to recognize a couple of our special guests, a couple of our folks on the chat line while we're trying to get you back on screen. First, I want to thank everybody who has joined us this evening. And again, welcome to our special MLK Holiday edition. I'd like to say what's up. Happy MLK Day. And of course, for those of you who are just tuning in for the first time this year, Happy New Year. Miss Celia Reese, thank you, and happy MLK Day to you as well. Karen Mack, it's been a while since we have seen you, Karen, on the show, so we want to thank you for joining us tonight, Karen. And the commish, Brother Ed Gray, we want to thank you for joining us tonight as well. Of course, folks, if you haven't tuned into the commish radio show on Saturdays as well, of course, hosted by Brother Ed Gray. And then, of course, our good friend, Uncle Asar Al-Kabilon of the African Genius podcast is where we want to thank you for joining us. So anyway, we do have your window, Professor Glover, on screen. We will at least have you here in principle until we get the video fixed, but we do want to continue to move forward with the conversation. So Jimmy, want to give you a couple of minutes to kind of provide any thoughts or any questions that you have as we continue to move forward.
Oh, I'm good, Tom. I do want to say thank you to everyone who's here tonight, and for all of the viewers who watch our show after hours from YouTube or other social media platforms. I will want to say that we reached 33,000 views last year, and we plan to do 3 times that. Based on our first week show numbers that came in, we'll probably hit 100,000 this year. So I just want to say thank you to all of the people who make this possible. This is your show just as well as ours. So if you have topics, things you want to talk about, please reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to set up a show for you.
All right. Professor Glover, what I am doing in the interest of time is I have put your image at the forefront of the show right now until maybe we can get the video fixed. So I'm going to continue to step back a little bit and let you move forward from your comments about the 1966 speech. But one thing, you did kind of speak to it a little bit, it being such a hidden jewel in the many speeches that Dr. King gave. And quite frankly, I'm from Dallas. My father grew up in Dallas. I was completely unaware that this could even happen.
Well, I think that, put it in the context of history, as I said, Dallas is the southern, first of all, Texas is a southern state, Dallas is a southern city. And both after the Civil War and going into 1865, when we began to see the movement of doing the Peters Colony here, where, let's go back to even Stephen F. Austin, who was the father of Texas, as we call him, who said that they could come to Texas and arise out of poverty by raising cotton, but they could not do it without the slaves. So that gave the impetus to move to what was then Mexico to build the Republic of Texas, which was 1863. Following that time, we had William Peter, who was the impresario, so was Stephen F. Austin. What we have talked about here is that Texas was land rich. It had a lot of money at the time, so what they did, they said that you could come here, and they would come out the South as the war was ending and so forth. You can come here and bring your slaves and work them. The Peters Colony would say that they would give you 640 acres as an Anglo man if you were married and bring your slaves. And then also, if you were single, they would give you 323 acres of land. And they needed 300 what they call settlers at the time. So Texas becomes this area, the Republic, of course, as we know it, in 1836, and to become a nation built on slavery, which has been abolished in the Deep South, and then eventually here in Texas in 1865. So Dallas in Texas becomes a haven, if you will, for the preservation of the Old South. When I arrived at SMU in 1979, they were still having the Old South Ball, where young men would ride their horses across campus and take invitations to young ladies. KAs had the second largest Confederate flag in the nation on the house. So Dallas was very much involved in the holding on to this old Southern aristocracy. We have later on, it was had the largest Klan membership in the nation. So we have to understand the context of Dallas in that regard, so that it's holding on to the old South, so that many African Americans became victims of that condition. In 1860, when the city was just being established, the burning down of the business district of Dallas. And we talked about that brother Ed Gray, who was doing great work with the monuments and the Martyrs Park, with Cato and others who were lynched, and the white abolitionists who were run out, who were fighting against slavery at the time, built around cotton and the industry of cotton here. So what I'm trying to give you is a narrative of what Dallas became as being a microcosm of what we call the old saving the South, or the lost cause that it was called. And so we see two really Dallases, to be honest, because you and I talked to the other day. There was East Dallas, Texas, which was started by William Gaston, a Confederate captain, and that's where the state fair is. That was not Dallas, Texas proper. That was East Dallas, Texas, and that was Dallas, Texas, where Deep Ellum starts. And you had the beginning of that area, which was annexed to Dallas later. But the whole goal has been to control this area, both in its wealth, coming out of the labor of African American people in the cotton fields, and the information, because the information, like Dr. King's speech and other things, would have given impetus to people in this city, your father, for example, and others, to have known about Dr. King's speaking. And I'm still encouraging us now to hear the speech. We still are literally not hearing Dr. King in Dallas because we have not listened to this speech in the city. It should be a part of classrooms, discussions, lectures. It should be played not just on the holidays, February, throughout the month. And even as we talk about, i.e. racial equity, used as a reference point.
No, that is great feedback. And using that as a reference point, Professor Glover, then we kind of talk about, the PBS documentary that you were involved with, and how that obviously came about with the celebration of the then inaugural celebration of the National Holiday. So give us a little bit of foreground about that, how that came about, and then let's lift it up from there.
Well, yes,
Come on, Tom. Professor, before you move on to that point, since we are talking about...
Wait a sec. I'm sorry, go ahead. Jimmy,
I'm sorry. Pardon my interruption for the professor. Before we move on to the next point, just want to ask, do we have a clip of the speech at SMU? Were we able to retrieve that we can present it?
No, we would literally, and since I have Professor Glover on the phone right now, I wouldn't be able to use it with my phone. And so we would have to use another method to pull that up.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought we had the clip of it. Okay, I'm sorry, Professor. Go ahead.
No problem. All right, go ahead, Professor Glover.
No, the way I became involved with this was that I was at El Centro as a campus minister at that time, and Betsy Terecki and we went to Atlanta in 1980. I gave a lecture in the Sisters Chapel at Spelman College on the theological application for nonviolent social change for youth on college campuses. And Mrs. King was in the audience, Dr. Lafayette, many of Dr. King's closest associates, and that's how they heard me give a lecture. And then I was brought into the inner circle with Mrs. King, Dr. Lafayette, Dr. C.T. Vivian, Dorothy Cotton. These are all Dr. King's close associates. And from that point, I began working with a program at the King Center called the National Consultation for the Development of Black Christian Student Leadership. And was the coordinator for several years and helping to train students on nonviolent principles. when a company called Idaho Film Company, Kel and Laurie Kearns, so here in Dallas, they were just looking to do they do peace movie. They did peace documentaries at the time, and they were not looking to do anything on the holidays. They were just trying to get information. But when they contacted Mrs. King at the King Center, she needed someone to do the documentary, and as a result of that, they were told to reach out to me. I was at SMU at the time, and they came to my office, and we met then, and I became the consultant and interviewer because they knew very little about Atlanta and the lay of the land. And so from the time we left here going to Atlanta, I coordinated where we would live, which that place at that time was Pastor Hotel, which was the center of Dr. King, where they would meet and eat, and many of the civil rights meetings were held. I knew Dr. Bernard, I knew Dr. Ralph Abernathy, I knew Hosea Williams, I knew different ones who I interviewed, and we interviewed not only Mrs. King, but we interviewed Bernice King, Dick Gregory, Bill Cosby, Bishop Tutu. They're all in the documentary. And so next Saturday at the African American Museum, I'm going to be giving my lecture from 3 to 5 at the African American Museum and showing the documentary for the community. So hopefully, if the weather's working well with us, you can come out and see. It's a 1-hour documentary, and we will discuss it in more detail.
Outstanding, outstanding. So you actually worked with Coretta Scott King, the beloved wife of Dr. King. Also, when we talked about this, you had talked about working with Rosa Parks as well. So given that, hopefully, folks who are watching this show now and in the future will have an opportunity to go back and look at that. Tell us a little bit about the significance of it. We use Dr. King as a reference point, as a foundation, as among other folks as well as our struggle for equality and freedom in the United States. That's the founding principles of the country. And so when you take us to this documentary, what are the salient points that people need to be aware of as we encourage them to go look at this? And then we talked about, that was then and where we're going now with the struggle.
Well, you just mentioned that. I think we need to understand, first of all, that you say the founding fathers of our country, we speak in a way that I think it's important. We were not included at that particular time of history, you see? And I know that we like to think that, but we were not involved. And we need to be true and honest to the context of our history as a nation. Dr. King was very clear that he had a quote that he would quote many times, and he said, "America is essentially a dream. It's a dream of a land where men of all colors and all creeds and all nationalities can live together as brothers." The essence of this dream is summed up in these words: "We hold these truths be self-evident that all men are created equal and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But ever since the founding fathers dreamed this dream, America has suffered what psychologists and psychiatrists call a schizophrenic personality tragically divided against itself, that while on one hand it proclaims life, liberty, and justice, it on the other hand practices the very opposite of its proclamation." In other words, she goes on to say that America is engaged in an act of illicit intercourse with injustice, unquote.
Gotcha. That is powerful.
Given that quote, we must recognize we cannot speak as though America was created for us, for people of color, for women, for poor white people, for that matter, It was created at the time for a particular group of individuals. The fact that Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and all the others, then later on even Robert E. Lee after the Civil War, that slavery was ingrained in the very fabric of the nation. It was because of the movements of abolitionist people and African people seeking freedom, being Frederick Douglass, others, John Brown, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, that they pushed the nation to go beyond its proclamation and to create an inclusive America. And that is the work of the early years, even after the Civil War, the 10 years of radical Reconstruction, from 1866 to 1877, which Dr. King alludes to when he says 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. So we have to, and that's what I'm saying to you again, we today must begin not simply looking at Dr. King as this you might say, this messianic prophet who we just run to and say, oh, he's gone, we have no hope anymore. No. Mrs. King and I would talk about that. That's the least thing that he would want us to do. He would want us to move out, to come to know what are the strategies. Not just Dr. King, who was before Dr. King, who was April Randolph, who was Fannie Lou Hamer, who were all these individuals that worked hard in the movement, the everyday folk, Bayard Rustin, the Bernard Lafayette, the Dorothy Cottons, the James Bevis, names that are not even talked about during the holiday season. That's the mechanism, the machinery of the movement. Because we need that machinery today as we hear about white men, particularly who are feeling as though their children are being attacked when they hear about slavery or Jim Crow. And what Dr. King said during that time is that the civil rights movement was designed to save the black man's body and the white man's soul. So we must create a language today that speaks to the oppressiveness, and this is very controversial to people when I say this, of white males. When I was working for the Dallas Police Department back in the 80s, when we had more killings of blacks by white police officers, I said that the most oppressed person in the 21st century would be the white male. And I meant by that is that if we do not create a context to bring white men along as society change, they will create an environment of reaction as we're seeing today. Mrs. Rosie Parks and I testified before Congress Committee on Justice with Congressman Conyers on that very fact. That's where you see a picture of Mrs. Parks and I, and we worked on issues of police brutality in the nation long before George Floyd. And we put in place here in Dallas the removal of deadly force, the removal of the chokehold under Chief Prince. All that happened here in Dallas. So we have to not only look at Dr. King, but also look at those of us who was the next generation, who did work, and then this generation that's now here, and build these bridges. It's just like a relay race. Be able to pass on, from as it was passed on to me from, my father was 95, my father was the same age, Dr. King. I was 10 years old, he was assassinated, but I was brought up under that with my aunts and my family of the movement. So we must look at the principles and talk about those principles more so than just talking about the man himself.
What does that look like when we talk about the principles?
Thank you. And that's what we did at the King Center. We talked about nonviolent principles of social change, a love ethic, agape love, nonviolent direct action, civil disobedience, all those components that Dr. King used in training those men and women at that time how to approach a system that would use violence against you. So by learning how to live and act in a nonviolent way, you literally disarm the persons who would otherwise seek to impose violence. You hear today, young men and women say, I know I wouldn't have done that back then. I couldn't have, well, we don't have enough guns to change anything. We don't have enough. As a matter of fact, as the Dr. King said, an eye for an eye leaves everyone blind. So you take these strategies that Gandhi used, that the Messiah used, that Jesus, and that have been used throughout generations to say how you disarm hatred and violence. And so you use that first by minimizing violence, you see. And then you begin to offensively move, as Dr. King moved into cities like Montgomery and Selma. We look at people like even our brother Malcolm, like Elie Shabazz. Dr. King the civil rights movement was an offensive movement. It went in and literally placed bodies in places, and not just adult bodies, but children, like in Birmingham. In the military sense, they say we're going to take Birmingham, we're going to take Selma. But that's what they did not want to happen in Dallas. The city fathers, if you will, did not want an offensive, nonviolent, direct action movement in this city, like you had in Selma, Montgomery, those other places. Because what it does, it pushes the system to look deeper into the structure of its operations. So that when you look at, then you deal with institutionalizing policies and practices that have to be put in place to change the context, ultimately, of the distribution of wealth. And that's what many people, Dr. King's latter life was about what? How ultimately do we create an economic plan that empowers poor people who have been the basic foundation for building, in this case, African enslaved and later on during Jim Crow. How do we create a system of economics that now embodies an empowerment of these individuals.
On that thought, and especially when you consider that when you look at Dr. King, he was very young. Obviously, Malcolm was a little bit older because, obviously, when he came to the front, he was, leaving prison. He was groomed by the nation. You look at the Black Panther Party, young. You look at a lot of these movements, they were orchestrated by, younger folks. And when you look at a lot of folks today, you mentioned as a reference point, I couldn't do that in terms of turning the other cheek. So when you speak, for instance, to the movement today, in your opinion as to what must be done, and you look to a group of young people who are of the opinion that in reference to the nonviolent movement, you still have people with their arms up in the air who are being murdered and or feel a little bit apprehensive about using a complete nonviolent approach to a group of folks who they're seeking respect but aren't getting respect regardless of how nonviolent they are. What is your message to them on that approach and how effective it is when they say, yes, we do have legislation, but economically, in terms of control of our neighborhoods, we still feel like we're in the same place?
We certainly could spend a week and a year, and we should on that comment, because nonviolence is a strategy. It's a method by which you are able to disarm a system or individuals without destroying your own moral character, first of all. And it is also logical because an oppressed people who do not have the military might to overthrow a system, it would be very illogical, if you will, to say to people, go out and sacrifice, which basically what it would be, a sacrifice. It would not be a logical military encounter, if you will. So with that in mind, you have to be logical in that regard. And so what nonviolence has done, I submit it has given us a way to fight, to engage in social change and minimizing violence. Again, it's a logical way because we do not have the military structure or even weapons as a group. And some young people say that they have a gun, they have this, but nowhere near what we should, what we could do against what is out there today. When I hear young men and women, even as we have in Dallas, who've gone through our marches and so forth, I've been there with the young people. Is that when you're able to show to the nation, as they did during the 60s, and the world sees that they would put dogs and water hoses on children, it brought the national, the world community to bear upon this issue at that time. And so you want to be able to have the moral court of the world on your side. And so you have to sit down and carefully think through these steps and these processes. Even with, you mentioned Malcolm and others, again, Malcolm, that was a defensive movement. I know Bobby Seale, who brought him in, a defensive movement. And those movements say, we will protect our communities, yes. We will not let you come in here so you're going to be a Black Panther, you're going to have an education program, a breakfast program. You have a right to say to a police officer, may I see your badge number, so give me your reporting officer. So there's discipline in that process, you see. And be able to sustain that community in a way that it's not being overrun. That's what the Black Panthers did. Malcolm X ultimately very somewhat different because he was so committed to the nation, as we know. But the differences that he had with the minister and later on with the nation as a whole placed him in opposition against the very organization that he led. And but as he was founding the Association of Black, this organization, his life was ended. But we must sit down now, and I can't do it all tonight, of course, and have deep conversations today about what it is and how nonviolent direct action, and if in the case of civil disobedience, can serve as a tool for social change in our society. We must recognize today that white men in particular now are hurting. They are January the 6th. How do we deal with this reaction to where we are today as a nation? How do we deal with the concept of making America great again? How do we deal with a nation in the midst of a presidential election? You take these tools from the 60s, both Dr. King, both Malcolm, both the North and the South, the whites, and this is a time for critical discussion and not just making quick snap reactions to it.
Jimmy, any thoughts or questions?
No, I'm good.
So as we fast forward, well, even before we fast forward, you mentioned it a couple of times, and I'm curious about you clarifying that. You mentioned earlier, I may have misunderstood you when you said the most oppressed person in the world in 2020. I don't know if it was 21st century was the white male.
That's correct. That's correct. Yes.
I said clarify what that means.
When you're engaging in a social movement, in which we were at the time, and those of us who lived at Jim Crow, which I did, I'm 67 years old. So as Dr. King and others, as we were coming out of the Jim Crow era, there are two things. There's change and transition. As they say, the only thing that's is permanent is change. Things are always changing, but with change comes transition. What transition is the process by which you go through a change. If you are having a social change, which we had in the 1960s in the Civil Rights Act, the Voters' Rights Act, with Lyndon Baines Johnson and others, and all these things in the legislation that is being signed, that African American people say, oh, wow, we now have access to education. Oh, wow, we have access to public accommodations. Now we have access to this and that. While we were celebrating those changes and going through those transitions with, jubilancy and excitement, you had white men upset. You see, their sons who were back then, a white male who was 10 years old, like myself, and like Dr. King's son, Martin III, and I, we were 10 years old. So while my father and Dr. King was saying, well, we have a chance to go to school, now we have a chance to go eat at a public counter, we can go to the bathrooms now where we want, we can ride on the bus seats where we want to now. You had just on the other side of the coin, you had white America, particularly white men, not being brought along, if you will. For me, that was a type of oppression, a psychological and mental oppression, to have that amount of change happen without anyone addressing these individuals at that time. So what you basically have is a wounded tiger that basically, if you turn your back on it, eventually that tiger will attack. And so that's what I submit to you has happened. We did not take in consideration how these white males would adjust to the change and how they would transition into the change, if you will.
So for the person who might say, well, if I look at Washington, D.C. and who runs the country and the legislature, who is creating policy for this country, where all the taxing authority drains money and where that goes, that's still overwhelmingly run by white men. If you look at banking institutions that provide access to capital, that's still overwhelmingly run by white men. In corporate America, which provides access to employment, that's still overwhelmingly run by white men. So how are they oppressed?
Again, I was speaking about a psychological oppression, Brother Sonny, in terms of when you change a system, what you just stated, and you began to impose upon a group of men who have had power for the last, say, 200 some years, and you now have to adjust to that. That alone, just like when men ourselves, in general, as men, when women began to get more access to opportunity, to power, we as men had to make adjustments, okay? And to those systems in which women now have access to. If a man is not prepared for that access of women into that transition, but today it's not perfect because a woman makes 68 cents for every dollar a man makes. So we still have not, as men, really come through the change because as you just alluded to, men still run the systems in America, just like white males still run the systems in America. I will submit to you the Otto Kerner report, and as those who are listening to go to Otto Kerner, it was the Kerner Commission report,
Yes.
which states that what white America doesn't understand, what white America doesn't understand that Black America could never forget is that white America created the ghetto, white America supports the ghetto, white America condones the ghetto. And that Kerner Commission report, it says that white America had to be about doing something in terms of a mindset as to change if the systems in the ghettos and other places. Ms. Ada Bernice Johnson, Congress that just passed, we give respect as well as several people. You know, I speak tonight, Ms. Rochelle Brown passed, Craig Watkins as well. Call their names and honor them during this season as well. Great contributors to our community. But I had the opportunity to sit down with, for an example, Channel 8, David Sletchen. He and I had lunch. He's a white male. And I talked to him about the oppression of Black African-American people, about how the system works. He didn't really understand that at the time. And I said to him, and I use this example, I said, you can't break a people's leg with a bat. I use a bat. I said, and blame him for the way they walk. But if you take a man, break his leg with a bat, then you blame him for the way he walks. But you don't understand that you have the bat. And we talked about that. And I said, well, there are still bats around here. And I said, well, all over, you have to go find them. You're the white male. Go find the bats. Well, he did. And if your listening audience will go and Google not only Dr. King's speech, but pull up Below 30. There's a series that David did on Channel 8 called Below 30. He interviewed many African-American people, but also he interviewed the banking system. He looked at the banking system and found out how difficult it was for African-Americans to get access to capital, Below 30. And it's a documentary. Well, in the process of that documentary, one of the people that know that I had helped to initiate that is that later on, Congressman Ada Bernice Johnson called a congressional hearing with congressional waters out of California and others. And then you can Google that as well. And now I'm waiting to see how well that congressional hearing and those recommendations have taken impact. But here again, it was a white male who actually did the documentary to go in and look at some of these disparities in terms of redlining and things like that. So here again, what I'm speaking to is you can't leave white men out of the equation of social change. That's why I call it moving from human diversity to human dignity. Now, we are all at the table. We all demand, we all deserve human dignity, you see.
So you mentioned...
Ask the professor, what does he think the outcome would have been if what he theorized would have happened?
If what now?
Repeat your question, Jimmy.
Yeah, ask Professor, what does he think would have happened if this had happened?
If what had happened?
Extrapolate, if what he called for would have happened, where would we be now? What would be different?
If Dr. King?
You mean Dr. King, Jimmy, or are we talking to somebody else?
No, we're talking about the recognizing the oppression, the psychological oppression by white men.
Yes.
So I think, Dr. Lawrence Kohlberg, when I was at Harvard, I was working with my work at Harvard on moral education, human development, Dr. Lawrence Kohlberg, and I encourage you all to look him up, talk about moral decision making, and found out that white men tend to be extremely legalistic in their view of moral issues, based upon the legal system, versus looking at the moral issue like Gandhi or Mother Teresa or Dr. King. And so when you look at white men, so for me, I study white males too in my work at SMU, my class, Black and White. We have to understand that they are an essential part of the social change process. And again, we cannot neglect them. And I think that has been one of our problems. We've neglected realizing that if we're going to have change in America, they must also be a part of the change.
What do you believe their channel is? When you say they've been neglected, what is their channel?
Oh yes, their channel. They've not been a part of the conversation of this change process. So when we go through, you can legislate You can see, Dr. King said you need both legislation and education. Legislation will keep you from hanging me, but education will help teach you about me. Even to the extent that when we talk about the whole textbook adoption process as we close this afternoon, when I became assistant superintendent of DISD when I left SMU, and we began working at the DISD, one of the first things I put in place, two things I put in place, like at SMU, was the diversity and harassment policy that says, no, you cannot, your behavior must change. You can't say, you can't do everything that you want to do. You can't do all the things that were being done on campuses in the community toward people of color. So that's very important. That's legislation, sir, that regulates people's behavior. But also what we did, we put into place what is called the first in the nation, the multicultural textbook adoption process. And at DISD, that's what Dr. King said with the institutionalized change as well. That changed the textbooks here in Dallas, which changed textbooks across the state, i.e. the nation. That's where the process started. And for 10 years, that went on until the State Board of Education began to reverse those things down in Austin. So you have the legislation, which says, then you have the education. Now, that's the challenging part, because that's where we are today. And so when you look at education and you began to say, okay, here's the scientist, here is the guy with the spaceship, Elon Musk,
yes,
others
Elon Musk.
Yeah, who are talking about diversity, this is racism, things like that. We're at the point now that we have to engage in what I call a very strong level of intellectual militancy, where we're able to come in with the arguments and the discussions to penetrate these arguments. And so that's why I'm using from human diversity to human dignity. We have to be able to come to the table, say to our white brothers and sisters, now you're saying that this is racism and your children. No, this is not racism. This is a part of the process. We're going through the labor pains of birth of literally a new nation where you, of course, are no longer the dominant, controlling individuals in this nation, i.e. in this world. That's a major transition, gentlemen. When we have to say that you can no longer have the power of your grandfather, your father. Now this is now where you share power with others. We're not there yet. But I submit to you that we have to make that a part of our agenda. They must, and as we put it, they must be a part of the white male in America, particularly as we move forward from this night. Must be a part of our agenda in terms of the social change, in terms of issues of civil rights and i.e. human rights.
Let me go ahead, Jimmy.
I was just saying, I was agreeing with the professor. It's a very good point. Poignant point.
When you talk about the social change, are you suggesting that white men wealthy white men who have run this country have not always been a part of what that social change has looked like for Black America?
Well, white men, first of all, let me say this. The Underground Railroad is not a black train. It's never been. The Underground Railroad has always been a train of black and white men working together, black and white women, be the Quakers, be they different people, John Brown, etc. So that, Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner. So what we're talking about is not new. It's not new at all.
Right.
But what we're talking about here in America and the world ultimately is that we're talking about a demographic shift where for the first time in the history that the numbers are, as they say, the numbers are there. People of color are now becoming the dominant numerical individuals, in particular in America. And so that by 30, 20, 40s, 50s, the majority of people of the nation of America will be people of color. And then white males know this. And so as we move in those, and then on the world level as well. So as we move into this numerical shift demographically, what does that mean? And we don't have the answers tonight, no. But how do we begin to include all of us in the conversation? How do we understand those? And there are those hardcore individuals who will say, no, we just die hard. We want to maintain like this. We know there will always be that. But we must, as we go forward, have them at the table. The scientists, the Musk, the voice. I've been reading about the owner of the Dallas Mavericks here.
Mark
Cuban.
Mark Cuban,
yeah.
Musk. There's a paper. You got these two individuals talking, two white men, but have different voices. They have to have those kind of conversations among themselves, okay? And what does it mean? Here is Cuban on one side, here's Musk on the other, right? And we have to let them have those hard conversations. We have to help those men who went to Washington on January 6th understand, you know, we got to understand that, no, we cannot have another civil war. There's a movie out, I don't know if you know that now, called Civil War, you see. So that in the minds of many whites, there is this perception that we must fight for our nation. And helping them understand that this is not their nation, this is truly our nation. And as we close tonight, that's the ultimate expression of this holiday, which should not just be a Dr. King holiday, but it should be a holiday of all Americans. And that civil rights of Dr. King only have helped us move closer to making America true to its creeds. You know, as I said earlier, through his creed that you know, we the people, you know, that all men, all women are created. You know, we're undelible, and among these are life, liberty, and pursuits of justice.
As we close out, as we have about 3 minutes before the end of the hour, and we look at some of the traditional organizations, institutions, some of which we have control of, some of which we don't have control, and they're really shaped by other folks. We look at the NAACPs of the world, the urban leagues. You look at the Black church, Black media. You look at historically Black colleges and university. And if we overlay that to your thesis for tonight in terms of where the struggle is now, outside of the realm of having white men with power in the conversation, what is your thesis on where they have to, in general, go if we're going to continue to extend and advance?
We have to begin tonight at home. We should not have to wait till. We should not. It is very sad that we wait to talk about Dr. King one night and we wait to talk about Black history in a month. Even though Dr. Carter G. Woodson started a week, Dr. Carter G. Woodson started, not white people. We have Dr. Martin Luther King holiday. Mrs. King started. It's not white people. But my point is that just like all cultures, we must become culturally literate as African-American people, particularly. Books in my covenant, Sankofa Education, home, church, school. Every home, every person on the sound of my voice, if you don't have a library of books in your house, you know, we're talking about banning books. No, I'm challenging every African-American. Most African-Americans don't even have an African-American book in their house. I'll submit to you. And they have their children to read. That's the first step, sir. We must have a campaign to put books in our home, educate our own, educate our children in our homes. Starving the wrong business before the Mayflower. You know, excellent book. Get Dr. King's book, Where Do You Go for Their Chaos of Community? You know, all his books, his writings. Listen to Dr. King's speech at SMU. Go online tonight, tomorrow. Listen to that. If you listen to it, give me a call. Reach out to me. Professor Glover, 214-546-3480. Email me, Clarence Glover Jr. at AOL.com. I'm challenging the community. You know, if we don't do our own education at home, then in our religious institutions that we still control, every African-American church should have a library. It should have a cultural program. Every congregation. That's where our schools started, in our African-American churches. I challenge my ministers, my brothers out there. I'm a minister as well. Every congregation. So you should say, where's the library of the church? Where's the cultural facility in our church? So by the time our children leave home and go through these institutions, even if they're not members of the church, they come in the community. Let them walk in, give them a hand them before, let them read. By the time they get to school, they would have already been culturalized in terms of African-American culture, history, be it Dr. King, be it whatever, African history, you know. That's our responsibility, is to do it. And so by the time they get into the larger system, they have a foundation of knowledge that we in our own community have given them.
Powerful. Powerful.
And I invite next Saturday at the African American Museum from 3 to 5.
Okay, there's Professor. Can we put in the chat? Can you put in the chat box also, Tommy?
Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Professor Glover.
No, we'll be at the African American Museum next Saturday from 3 to 5.
And if
continuing our celebration of Dr. King.
Okay, good deal. And if you could just repeat that again, just to make sure that everybody got that twice.
The African American Museum at Fair Park from 3 to 5 o'clock. We will be there in person if all is well. continuing this conversation about the documentary, about what we should be doing, and connecting with each other.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, Professor Glover, again, we thank you for your time. We thank you for everything that you shared with us this evening. Jim, if you have any other thoughts before we get started, I have put Professor Glover's information in the chat line if anyone needs to get in contact with him.
Yes. So thank you once again, Professor. And like I said, we welcome you back anytime. It's always a joy. You bring a great deal of wealth and knowledge to our show and to our viewers. So we appreciate you for that.
We thank you all both for what you do and continuing with the great work.
Thank you, sir. And folks, that is it for tonight. We appreciate everyone who joined us this evening. Continue to, again, and we didn't, I don't know if we even said, Jimmy, make sure that if you enjoyed this, do subscribe, do like, do share this information.
Yes, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and then spread the word so you have something interesting to talk about. Everybody should have been here because Professor Glover always brings a great deal of wealth and knowledge to the show. So, so now you have something interesting to talk about for the rest of the week.
And with that being said, we will see you this Wednesday, Jimmy, because
we'll see you in 2 days. Yes,
exactly. Because if it is Wednesday night, Jimmy,
certainly it's Black Men Speak.
Good night, everyone.